Everything I was, everything I loved, vanished in an instant. I looked out the window. The sky was still there, but for me it no longer held meaning. I asked myself, is it worth going on? Make sure to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any inspiring stories I share. The sun rose on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange, while the roar of engines sliced through the air. On the runway, Captain Isabela Rivas, a woman with a commanding presence and eyes that seemed to hold all the skies she had ever flown, adjusted her helmet with the precision of someone who had repeated this ritual thousands of times. At 34 years old, Isabela was not only one of the best pilots in the armed forces, but also a legend in aerial acrobatics, renowned for her ability to execute impossible maneuvers and her fearless resilience under pressure. From a young age, Isabela had a special relationship with the sky. She grew up in a small town surrounded by open fields, where her father, an aviation mechanic, taught her the names of the clouds and the unique sound of every airplane engine. By the time she was 10, while other kids played in parks, Isabela was piloting ultralights under her father's watchful eye. At 17, she earned her pilot's license, and by 21, after graduating with honors from the military academy, she was already flying combat jets on strategic missions. Her success, however, extended beyond her technical skills. Isabela was a natural leader, commanding respect from both subordinates and superiors. Her peers often joked that if there was a god of the skies, it must surely be named Isabela Rivas. Yet beneath the confident exterior was a woman whose life revolved around a single passion: flying. Captain Rivas had made the skies her home and her military career her sanctuary. Her life was structured, almost monastic, meticulously designed to maximize her time in the air. Deep friendships were rare, as her days were consumed by flight simulators, physical training, and missions. And yet, she never felt like anything was missing. The roar of an engine, the wind against her face, and the feeling of freedom thousands of feet above the ground were enough to fulfill her completely. Despite her dedication, Isabela was not immune to challenges. In recent weeks, tensions had risen due to a critical mission in a conflict zone. The operations had become increasingly intense, with zero room for error. Even so, Isabela maintained her characteristic composure, leading her squadron with precision and determination. The night before the mission, as she reviewed the flight plans in the solitude of her quarters, Isabela allowed her mind to wander for a moment. She thought about her childhood, the afternoons spent with her father, and how those days had shaped her destiny. She had dedicated her life to the skies, and although she knew flying could take everything away in an instant, she wasn't afraid. It was in that uncertainty, in the fine line between control and chaos, where she found her purpose. That morning, as she powered up the engines and felt the jet's force under her command, Isabela couldn't have known that her life was about to change forever. What had been a life defined by excellence and discipline would soon become a struggle to rediscover who she was without the sky beneath her wings. The operation was in full motion. Inside the jet's cockpit, the air was dense, not from pressure but from the tension that filled the team. From her position as leader, Captain Isabela Rivas checked her instruments while listening to her squadron's communications. Each member held their formation with precision, their jets slicing through the sky as if they were extensions of their will. The mission was clear: neutralize an enemy base in a hostile region. It wouldn't be easy, but Isabela had led more complex operations before. She knew how to calculate risks and keep her team safe. Eagle 1 to squadron: maintain formation and prepare for descent. Priority: execute and evacuate. No unnecessary heroics, she commanded, her voice steady and calm, a beacon for her comrades amidst the chaos. As they approached their target, the radar began flashing red. Enemy anti-air missiles had been activated, filling the skies with mortal threats. Eagle 3, evasive maneuvers. Eagle 4, hold your position, she ordered, angling her jet into a sharp turn that pressed her body against the crushing force of gravity. Alarms blared in her cockpit, but Isabela wasn't fazed. In the midst of the frenetic dance of missiles and countermeasures, something unexpected happened. Eagle 5 is in trouble, one of the pilots reported. From her position, Isabela saw one of her squadmates' jets hit, spinning out of control. The pilot's panicked voice crackled over the comms. Without hesitation, Isabela altered her course to intercept. Eagle 1, moving in for rescue. Hold your position and stay calm, she instructed, her tone controlled. What happened next occurred in seconds, though for Isabela, it felt like an eternity. Positioning herself to draw enemy fire away from her teammate, a tracer missile locked onto her jet. Isabela attempted one last evasive maneuver, but the projectile struck her right wing. The explosion was deafening, and the world around her became a whirlwind of fire and debris. The cockpit lost pressure, alarms screamed their warnings, and the controls barely responded. "Mayday, Mayday, Eagle One has been hit," she reported, her voice eerily calm despite the chaos. Her training took over, guiding her actions. She angled the damaged jet, scanning for a place to make an emergency landing. Every muscle in her body strained as she fought against gravity and the failing controls. Finally, she spotted a clearing in the barren, rocky terrain below. She knew the chances of survival were slim, but she had no choice. The impact was brutal. The jet skidded across the ground like a wounded beast, kicking up a storm of dust and debris. Isabela felt a sharp, searing pain in her back as the aircraft came to a stop, but there was no time to process it. Survival was her only thought. The cockpit was wrecked, and an eerie silence filled the air. When she finally opened her eyes, the pain was like an electric shock coursing through her. She tried to move, but her body refused to respond. That was when she realized something was terribly wrong. She looked down at her motionless legs, and a chilling wave of dread washed over her. Despite the agony, she managed to activate her radio. "This is Eagle One. I'm alive but need immediate assistance." Minutes later, her team arrived at the crash site. They carefully extracted her from the wreckage as she drifted in and out of consciousness, still issuing orders through gritted teeth. "The enemy is close. Secure the perimeter," she murmured before succumbing to the darkness. When Isabela awoke, she was in a field hospital. The white ceiling and the hum of monitors were the first things she noticed. She tried to sit up, but a stabbing pain forced her to stop. A doctor entered the room, his expression grave but composed. "Captain Rivers, it's a miracle you're alive," he began, his tone carrying the weight of unwelcome news. "We did everything we could, but the impact caused severe damage to your spinal cord. You won't be able to walk again." The words fell like a death sentence. Isabela, who had spent her entire life pushing the limits of the human body, was now trapped in a physical prison. She tried to process what she was hearing, but her mind refused to accept it. "What about my squadron?" she asked, ignoring the weight of the news. The doctor reassured her that her team was safe, thanks to her maneuver. While the hospital staff spoke of her bravery, Isabela could barely hear them. Part of her wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers. But all she felt was an overwhelming emptiness. The sky, her refuge, her reason for being, had been taken from her. And what remained was the uncertainty of a future she couldn't imagine. What she didn't know yet was that, beyond the physical injuries, she would soon face a storm of doubts and accusations that would challenge everything she had ever been. The hospital room was silent, but Isabela Rivas' mind was a storm of chaos. Weeks had passed since the accident, and although her body was beginning to stabilize, her spirit lay in ruins. The physical pain of recovery was substantial, but it paled in comparison to the emptiness she felt each time she looked at her motionless legs. Every day, she woke up hoping it had all been a nightmare, but the reality remained the same. The situation worsened when she received news she never imagined. A military investigation was underway, and the initial findings were devastating. Reports suggested that Isabela, in her maneuver to save her teammate, had acted recklessly, deviating from protocol and endangering the mission. Instead of being hailed as a hero, her sacrifice was being questioned. Some of her superiors, pressured by the partial failure of the operation, pointed to her as responsible. "It's impossible they're saying this," she thought, her chest tight with anger and helplessness. But the accusation spread through internal military channels, and her reputation began to crumble. Isabela, who had always been admired for her excellence, was now the subject of debate. Some defended her, others criticized her, but no one truly knew what had happened in that jet. Her days of glory felt distant, replaced by a shroud of doubt. One day, while trying to regain strength in the rehabilitation room, someone she never expected walked in. It was Lieutenant Richard Montgomery, her closest friend and someone she had trusted completely. For years, they had shared missions, strategies, and confidences. If anyone would stand by her, Isabela thought, it would be him. But Richard's face didn't bring relief, it carried a chill. He crossed his arms, avoiding direct eye contact. "I need answers, Isabela," he said, his tone sharper than she had ever imagined. "They're saying you acted outside protocol, that you put us all at risk." His words hit her like a missile straight to the chest. "You believe that too?" she asked, her voice breaking. Richard, clearly uncomfortable, looked away. I don't know. I just know a lot of people are looking for someone to blame, and your decision. It was questionable. The silence that followed was louder than any explosion. Isabela couldn't believe that Richard, her battle companion, doubted her. I made that decision to save a life. If I'd followed protocol, we would have lost Eagle 5, she retorted firmly. But Richard didn't respond, and his lack of words hurt more than any accusation. When he left, Isabela stared at the closed door, feeling her world shrink even further. The few ties she had left seemed to unravel. How could she move forward if even those who knew her doubted her? The nights were the worst. Alone in her room, the memories of the accident haunted her relentlessly. She would close her eyes and see the missile, the explosion, the fire. She heard her teammates' screams over the radio. And then the pain, a constant reminder of her failure. She couldn't escape the guilt. Although she knew she had made the right choice, she couldn't stop wondering if she could have done it better, if she could have avoided everything. The darkness in her mind became unbearable. One day, after an especially grueling physiotherapy session, Isabela sat by the window in her room. From there, she could see the sky, vast and clear, so close yet so unreachable. She wondered if the sky missed her as much as she missed it. And for the first time, she thought about letting it all go. The thought was terrifying and at the same time, strangely liberating. If she could no longer be who she was, if her life had lost its purpose, what was the point of continuing? That night, her trembling hands wrote a letter. To whoever finds me, it began, I want you to know I gave it my all. My only regret is not being enough. Fate, however, had other plans. At the darkest moment of her life, an unexpected visitor arrived. It was Colonel Ernest Valens, an older man who had been her mentor during her early years in the Air Force. Though his figure was slightly hunched with age, he still exuded an unshakable authority. Valens looked at her calmly, as if he could read her thoughts. Without a word, he picked up the letter she had left on the table and tucked it into his pocket. Then he sat across from her. Rivers, he began, his deep voice steady and firm. Do you know why I'm here? Isabela didn't respond. Valens continued. Because I've been where you are now. Injured, doubted, without a purpose. I thought my life was over. But I was wrong. The intensity in his gaze made Isabela lift her head. Life isn't defined by what you lose, but by what you do with what's left. His words struck something deep inside Isabela. How am I supposed to go on? I'm not a pilot anymore. I'm not anything, she said, her voice breaking. Valens shook his head. You're so much more than you think. What you've been through, what you've learned, it can save lives. But you have to decide whether to let the past consume you or use it to build something new. That moment marked the beginning of a shift within her. It wasn't an immediate transformation, but it planted a seed of hope. Valens didn't give her all the answers, but he left her with enough to make her wonder if there was still a path forward, even if it was one she'd never imagined. The decision to move forward came without fanfare or promises of immediate success. It was a small, almost timid step, but it was enough to mark a change. Inspired by Colonel Ernest Valens' words, Isabela Rivas accepted the position he offered her, flight instructor at the military academy. At first, she saw it as a punishment disguised as an opportunity, but she quickly realized it was much more than that. The first time she rolled into the academy hangar, her wheelchair squeaked slightly against the polished floor. Around her, young cadets filled the space with laughter and enthusiasm, some stealing glances at the fallen legend. Isabela held her head high, though her stomach churned with nerves. Being the only person in a wheelchair in a world where physical strength and mobility were paramount felt like stepping onto hostile ground. Her first day as an instructor was a disaster. Standing, or rather sitting, before a group of students, she tried to explain an evasive maneuver, but the memories of her accident clouded her mind. She stammered, lost her train of thought, and ended the class early. On her way out, she overheard some of the students murmuring, "Does she really have anything to teach us?" Those words pierced her pride, but not her determination. That night, as she reviewed the plans for her upcoming lessons, she realized she was trying to be someone she no longer was. She couldn't teach from the perspective of a perfect pilot because she wasn't one anymore. But she had something even more powerful, the experience of having faced the worst possible scenario. She decided to change her approach. In her next class, she arrived with a series of recordings from real missions, including the footage of her own accident. Today, we're going to talk about what happens when everything goes wrong, she said, looking directly at the students. The room fell silent, and for the first time, Isabela felt she had their full attention. She talked about the decisions she had made that day, what had worked, and what hadn't. She didn't embellish the facts or hide her mistakes. Instead, she turned them into practical lessons. One of the cadets raised his hand, a bright-eyed young man who seemed particularly engaged. "Captain Rivers, do you regret what you did?" The question caught her off guard, but she didn't hesitate to respond. "No. Saving a life is always worth it. But I learned that even the right decisions have consequences. And that's something all of you need to understand before you get into a cockpit." Over time, the students began to see her differently, not as a fallen legend, but as a mentor who spoke from experience rather than a textbook. Isabela started noticing small changes in herself too. Her confidence, still fragile, slowly began to rebuild. Physiotherapy sessions felt less like torture and more like a challenge to prove she still had something to give. On one occasion, a senior instructor invited her to observe a combat simulation. At first, she hesitated. Sitting at the controls, even in a simulated environment, brought back painful memories. But when she took the seat and guided the team through a combat scenario, she remembered why she had loved flying so much. Although her body could no longer endure the strain of a real jet, her mind was as sharp as ever. In that moment, she understood that her value wasn't in her legs, but in her experience and knowledge. One day, as she was reviewing maneuvers with a group of students in the hangar, she received unexpected news. The young pilot she had saved during her final mission, known as Eagle 5, had awakened from the coma he had been in since the accident. A whirlwind of emotion swirled within her, relief, anxiety, and a spark of hope. Perhaps with his testimony, the doubts that had haunted her since that fateful day could finally be put to rest. For now, however, Isabela chose to focus on what she could control. Her work as an instructor had become more than a job, it was her purpose. Each time she saw one of her students master a complex maneuver or make smart decisions under pressure, she felt that her experience, however painful, had not been in vain. On one occasion, a student approached her after class. "Captain Rivers, I just wanted to thank you. Your story inspired me to stick with this, even when I thought about quitting," he said, his tone sincere enough to surprise her. For the first time in a long while, she felt something akin to pride, not for what she had done in the past, but for what she was doing now. Though the road was long and full of challenges, Isabela was finding her place again. And while she would never soar through the skies as she once had, she had discovered that true flight wasn't in the wings, it was in the impact she could have on those around her. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. For Isabela Rivers, each day brought a new challenge, but also a small victory. She no longer avoided mirrors or the memories of her past. She had learned to look at herself honestly and accept what she saw, a woman marked by pain but not defined by it. The process was slow, often frustrating, but also filled with discoveries that led her toward a stronger version of herself. One of the key moments in her emotional recovery was reconnecting with her former teammates. Though she had initially isolated herself, fearing judgment or rejection, several of them began visiting her, each in their own way seeking to mend the silences that had hurt her so deeply. One of the first to return was Lieutenant Richard Montgomery, who had been both her friend and her harshest critic after the accident. One afternoon, as Isabela supervised a simulation exercise, Richard appeared unexpectedly in the hangar. His figure was familiar, but his expression carried something different: regret. He approached her cautiously, as if afraid she might turn him away. "Captain Rivers," he began, using her rank as a gesture of respect. "I want to apologize. I was wrong to doubt you. It wasn't fair, and I know that now. You always put the team first. I just didn't have the courage to see it then." Isabela regarded him silently for a few moments, processing his words. Finally, she nodded. "War pushes all of us to our limits, Montgomery. But at least you're here now. That's what matters." Though her words were measured, the act of forgiveness marked the beginning of reconciliation between them. Isabela's circle also began to grow with the students and colleagues who surrounded her. Each day, she found new reasons to feel proud of what she was building. She became a mentor and counselor, not only for aspiring pilots but also for other veterans struggling with their own internal battles. Her voice, firm and imbued with experience, became a beacon for many who felt lost. One of the most transformative moments came with the recovery of the pilot she had saved, Eagle 5, whose name was Santiago Guzman. When Santiago approached her for the first time since the accident, He leaned on a cane to walk, but his smile radiated gratitude. "Captain Rivers, I'll never be able to thank you enough," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "If I'm here, it's because of you. I've heard what they've said about your decision that day, but let me make this clear. You didn't abandon your post. You saved us all." Santiago, who had been unconscious during the accusations and public scrutiny, decided to speak out. At a formal meeting with the Air Force's High Command, he presented a detailed report of what he remembered from the accident, supported by recovered flight data. His testimony not only exonerated Isabela, but also exposed the errors of those who had questioned her sacrifice. The news of her official exoneration arrived one morning while she was overseeing a simulation. A high-ranking representative sought her out in the hangar, handing her a sealed envelope. As she read it, emotions overwhelmed her. The accusations had been dismissed, and her heroic act would be publicly recognized. The official recognition, however, was not Isabela's greatest triumph. What truly filled her with pride was the personal transformation she had achieved. Accepting her physical limitations had been one of the greatest challenges, but she faced it with the same determination she had shown in combat. She learned to work with her body in new ways, even incorporating adaptive sports into her daily routine. Aviation remained her passion, but it was no longer her only identity. Her former teammates began to see her not as a fallen pilot, but as a symbol of resilience. At an informal gathering, one of them, holding a beer, summed up what many felt. "Rivers, you were always our best pilot. Now, you're also our example." Isabela also began to speak publicly about her experiences. At conferences and military events, she shared her story, not from a place of pain, but of overcoming. With every word, she felt herself healing and realized that, by telling her story, she might help others find their own way back. The past didn't disappear entirely, but it ceased to be an unbearable weight. Isabela understood that the accident had changed her, but it hadn't destroyed her. She had lost her wings, yes, but in their place, she had gained something more enduring, a deeper purpose, a renewed connection with those around her, and a full acceptance of who she was. The big day arrived, solemn and charged with emotion. At the main airbase, a military ceremony had been organized to honor acts of bravery and sacrifice during high-risk missions. Among the names on the list of honorees was Captain Isabela Rivers. Her physical and emotional recovery had led her to this moment, but it wasn't the recognition that filled her with pride, it was the opportunity to speak in front of her peers and future pilots. The hangar was packed with officers, cadets, veterans, and military reporters. At the center stood a stage adorned with the Air Force insignia, awaiting the honorees. Isabela, dressed impeccably in her uniform and seated in her wheelchair, held her head high, her posture as resolute as it had been during her flying days. She could feel every gaze on her, but she remained calm, confident in who she was and what she had accomplished. The general in charge of the ceremony took the microphone. "Today, we honor those who have demonstrated unwavering commitment to duty and sacrifice. Among them is a story that embodies the essence of our force, that of Captain Isabela Rivers." As the general recounted the events of the day of the accident, including Santiago Guzman's testimony that had cleared her name, the applause grew louder. When she was finally invited to the stage, the audience rose to their feet. The thunderous ovation echoed throughout the hangar, but Isabela remained composed as she approached the podium. She took the microphone, looking out at the crowd with a mix of gratitude and determination. "Thank you for this honor," she began, her voice steady and clear. "But more than recognizing my sacrifice, I want us to reflect today on what it means to overcome adversity." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Losing the ability to fly was, for me, losing what I loved most. But in that process, I discovered something equally powerful, the ability to guide others. What I learned in the darkest moments of my life doesn't have to end with me. It can be the light others follow in their own storms." Speaking about her experience felt like reliving it, but this time with a different purpose. Isabela used the moment to emphasize the importance of resilience, teamwork, and recognizing the value of sacrifices that aren't always immediately understood. "Flying isn't just the act of soaring through the skies," she continued. "It's also the ability to lift others, to teach them how to face the impossible and keep moving forward. If my story can inspire even one of you to rise after a fall, then all of this will have been worth it." When she finished, the applause filled the hangar once again. In that instant, Isabela didn't see a crowd but individuals, young cadets with dreams in their eyes, veteran comrades who had fought their own battles, and a close circle of colleagues who now felt like family. "I hope you enjoyed this story. I'm sure you'll also love the next one. Click on the video on the screen right now, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this in the future. Thank you for watching until the end. See you soon.